in the middle of the rolling hills and pine-dotted ridges. There once stood a cabin that had been in my family for 3 generations. It wasn't large or lavish, but it carried the weight of memory and history in every creaking beam and weathered plank. Built by my grandfather's hands, the cabin served as a backdrop of countless summers, family reunions, and quiet retreats. It stood not as a monument to wealth, but as a testament to belonging, proof that my family had roots in this community long before manicured lawns and homeowners associations arrived. But as the years went on, the land surrounding the cabin transformed. Developers carved winding cul-de-sacs into the forest, erecting sprawling, modern houses with gleaming stone facades and triple garages. A homeowners association was born out of this development, eager to impose its rules on every parcel, every blade of grass, every life within its domain. At the head of it all stood Linda Marston, the HOA president, who thrived on wielding control like a scepter. Linda was known for her towering hair, sharper-than-steel manicures, and the kind of smile that only appeared when she was about to enforce a rule or squash dissent. For years, my cabin had been a sore spot for her and the HOA board. It didn't fit the aesthetic. It was rustic, made of logs darkened with age, standing apart from the sea of uniform houses painted in shades of beige and slate. They told me it looked out of place, that it was an eyesore, even though it had been there long before their rules or their bylaws. At every meeting, Linda made it clear she wanted the cabin gone, but I reminded her that my property wasn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction. That cabin and the land it sat on was mine, free and clear. Or so I thought. One summer weekend, I drove out to property as I always did, expecting to see the familiar roof line peeking out from behind the trees. But as I pulled up the dirt path, I froze. Where the cabin once stood, where 3 generations of my family had laughed, grieved, and lived, there was nothing. Not a wall, not a splinter, just a scar of earth, scraped raw and leveled as if the cabin had never existed. I stood there in disbelief, my heart thundering in my chest. The front porch where my grandfather used to sit at sunset was gone. The stone chimney my father and I had repaired together was gone. Every photograph, heirloom, and memory kept inside vanished. In its place, construction markers dotted the ground, spray paint slashed across the dirt, and a wooden sign announced, "Future site of Marston residence." Linda Marston, the HOA president, had built her claim right over my past. It didn't take long before I uncovered the scheme. Under the guise of community improvement, the HOA had quietly redrawn certain property lines in their records. Though I had never signed anything, never agreed anything, they had filed paperwork with the county that placed my land within their association's control. Then, with a rubber stamp and a few forged documents, Linda had declared the cabin non-compliant and unsafe, authorizing its demolition without so much as notifying me. The wrecking crew had swept in, gutted the land, and cleared the space for Linda's newest conquest, her mansion. The betrayal was staggering. I had heard stories of HOAs tearing down sheds, slapping homeowners with fines, and dictating paint colors. But this was something else entirely. This was theft dressed in the clothes of authority. Linda hadn't just bulldozed my cabin. She had bulldozed my family's legacy. Standing there, I felt powerless, yet burning with resolve. They thought I wouldn't fight back. They thought I would roll over and accept what had been done. But the HOA had underestimated one thing. I wasn't just any homeowner. I had a paper trail, I had history, and I had the law on my side. That night, I returned home with a folder in my hands and a fire in my chest. Inside that folder were the original property deeds, notarized and filed decades ago, untouched and irrefutable. Every signature, every boundary marker, every stamp was proof that the land was mine and had always been mine. And with those documents, I was going to take back everything they had stolen. As I prepared for the legal battle ahead, I began to realize this was more than a fight for property. It was a fight against corruption, arrogance, and unchecked power. The HOA had destroyed my cabin, but in doing so, they had awakened something far stronger in me. The determination to see justice done, no matter the cost. And so, the first shot in the war was fired. Linda thought her mansion would rise triumphantly over my land, but she had no idea the storm that was coming. Because when you erase a family's history, you don't just build a house. You build a case against yourself. And my case was just beginning. Got it? Here's Chapter 2 in the same HOA drama, narration-only style, continuing from Chapter 1. Chapter 2, The Battle in the Boardroom. When I stepped into the HOA boardroom for the first time after discovering the destruction of my cabin, the air was thick with smug satisfaction. Rows of leather chairs lined a polished mahogany table. At the head sat Linda Marston herself, looking as though she owned not just a room, but the entire community. The other board members, carefully chosen allies who owed their positions to her influence, shuffled papers and avoided my eyes. They already knew what had happened, and they already knew I had come for answers. The room had the sterile chill of bureaucracy. A projector glowed with slides about landscaping guidelines and approved exterior paint colors, as if the loss of my home was nothing more than a footnote in their endless obsession with uniformity. But beneath the surface, tension was bubbling. Linda's lips curled into that practiced, tight-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. She believed she had already won. I laid my folder on the table, the sound sharp in the silence. Inside were the original property deeds, maps, and notarized records. As I spread them out, I saw flickers of unease ripple through the board members, though Linda didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in feigned composure, but I caught the subtle tightening of her jaw. For the first time, she realized I wasn't here to beg. I was here to fight. The board meeting that followed was not about community policies or neighborhood disputes. It was a courtroom in miniature, a stage where Linda tried to justify what she had done. She spoke of safety hazards and community aesthetics, of bylaws that allowed the removal of non-compliant structures. But her words were hollow against the truth I laid before them. My cabin was never under HOA jurisdiction. Their bylaws had no authority over my land. The demolition was not enforcement. It was trespass, pure and simple. The other board members shifted uncomfortably as I recited dates, case numbers, and legal precedents. They had signed their names to Linda's schemes, likely without realizing the consequences. Now, with every page I presented, they began to see the liability hanging over their heads like a storm cloud. Linda, however, dug her heels in deeper. To admit fault was to admit weakness, and Linda Marston was a woman who thrived on appearances. The confrontation dragged late into the evening. By the end, the board was fractured. Some murmured about revisiting the matter or seeking counsel, their confidence in Linda waning. Others remained loyal, clinging to her authority out of fear or self-interest. But one thing had become clear. The HOA was not a united front, and where there was division, there was opportunity. I walked out of that boardroom with no apologies, no restitution, and no justice. But I did not walk out empty-handed. I left knowing Linda had made her first mistake, underestimating the depth of my resolve and the strength of my evidence. She had thought this would be a closed matter, buried under paperwork and her iron grip on the board. Instead, I had dragged it into the light, forcing her to defend what could not be defended. The next step was the courthouse. I knew that a battle this large could not be won in meetings designed to intimidate dissent. It had to be fought on neutral ground, where rules were not written by Linda's hand, but by the law itself. Every document I carried, every signature my grandfather left behind, would speak louder than Linda's carefully rehearsed speeches. But as I left the meeting, I couldn't shake the sense that Linda was already plotting her counterattack. She was not a woman who lost gracefully. She had too much pride, too much invested in the image of being untouchable. Her mansion was already under construction, beams rising on the soil where my cabin had stood, and she would not let anything threaten that vision. That night, as I drove home, I passed the skeletal frame of her mansion looming against the twilight sky. It stood as a monument to her arrogance, a gaudy reminder of everything I had lost. But to me, it wasn't a symbol of defeat. It was evidence. Every nail hammered into those beams was a crime. Every wall raised a line in the case I was building. The HOA thought they could rewrite history, but history has a way of preserving the truth, and the truth was on my side. I had exposed the cracks in Linda's empire, but I knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The courtroom would not just test the strength of my case, but the endurance of my will. Linda had money, influence, and an entire association behind her. All I had was a law and my determination. But sometimes, that's all it takes to bring down an empire built on lies. The HOA boardroom felt more like a courtroom. Linda flaunted bylaws, claiming my cabin was non-compliant. But the deeds I laid out proved otherwise. Board members wavered, realizing the risk of siding with her. Linda stayed defiant, masking fear with arrogance. As I left, I knew she'd strike back, but her mansion's rising frame wasn't a victory. It was evidence. The cracks in her empire had begun to show, and soon the law would break it wide open.